On September 9th, 2025, Charlie Kirk was murdered by a single gunshot to his neck. Kirk was hosting one of his Prove Me Wrong debates, answering questions about gun violence when a shooter took aim from a large building about 200 yards away from the stage. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this situation. And let me be clear, no one should ever advocate or be advocating for political violence. No one should be celebrating the fact that a man was gunned down in front of thousands of people and that his wife and children were horrifically able to watch that. That is all true. It is also simultaneously true that the GOP pundits and politicians should not be claiming that Democrats own this moment of violence, especially now that we know more about the shooter's motivations and background. After all, people in glass houses should not throw stones, right? What we should be doing right now is talking about how we can prevent the countless mass shootings that overwhelmingly occur in our schools and workplaces, at our churches and events, on highways, and in sundown towns where people of color are stopped and frisked, and sometimes murdered for no reason other than the color of their skin. We should be finding solutions, not blaming Democrats and inciting more violence the way that President Taco did before learning a single verified thing about this killer. And that's what we're going to attempt to unpack in today's show. We are the anomaly. Immediately following the news of Charlie Kirk's shooting and then death, the response from the right and left was, if nothing else, polarizing AF. People on the right, including Don McCankles and Pete Swear's Gin and Tonic Hegseth, responded by celebrating Kirk as a hero and by decrying this as a tragedy. And they're right about part of that. It is a tragedy. It should not have happened. Taco went then so far as to demonize the radical left for inciting political violence in this country, claiming that the man who is suspected of carrying out the assassination of Charlie Kirk was attacking America, potentially inflaming even more political violence. And he claims his administration will be going after everyone that supports attacks like this, and conflates these things with the largely non-violent protests against ICE. Ironic, considering what happened on January 6th. Hegseth hosted a press conference on 9/11 and celebrated Charlie as a hero. And we've seen a lot of people on the right clutch their collective pearls, as many people on the online left expressed apathy at the news of Kirk's death, with so many sharing memes and posts talking about the harm that Charlie had actually done to America's political discourse. They were using Charlie's own words, and yet the right turned around and claimed that that was inflammatory messaging and is proof that the left is inherently violent. But did you know that while the media was freaking out about Charlie Kirk, the GOP-led Senate narrowly defeated an amendment to release the Epstein files? I am sure the outrage coming from the regime is definitely not related to all of that, though, right? Right? But let's get real for a minute. The response from left-leaning folks right now, that apathy, wouldn't be as surprising if the folks on the right were aware of how much news crosses our feeds, or what those of us who work in journalism or media have to witness on a daily basis when it comes to gun violence, when it comes to how America ignores this epidemic of school shootings. And I'm not talking about the MAGA politicians and the so-called truth-telling debate bros. I'm talking about real people, maybe even some of you watching the show right now. If real people weren't misled by the algorithm, which tailors your feed based on your interests and sometimes deliberately avoids showing you the harsh reality of gun violence, it also hides the massive peaceful protests against Taco, ICE, and all the studies that prove there is a disturbing trend behind the gun violence that we experience in the U.S. Maybe those people would feel very different about what happened on September 10th as well. I'm not going to celebrate the man's death. I'm not a monster. I will be honest, though, I don't think that Charlie Kirk was a good person. And I will not hide that fact just because the epidemic that is gun violence in the United States has finally touched and harmed one of MAGA's own. Charlie Kirk's wife and children should not have had to experience what they lived through that day. They now join countless survivors of school shootings and gun violence all over this country. But the shooter, as we will find out later on in the show, was not the trans-identifying lefty that the regime wants you to think that he was. He came from a MAGA, gun-loving household. And as it turns out, the phrases on the aligned murder weapon more than likely belong to the Gen Z meme Groyper culture, a 4chan adjacent white supremacist movement. It views Charlie Kirk as being too liberal and has a direct connection to Nick Fuentes, a self-proclaimed white supremacist content creator. We're also getting a puzzling amount of constantly changing information that could be considered mistruths from FBI Director Kash Patel. The same Kash Patel helped found the Kash Foundation, which is a nonprofit that helps participants in the January 6th United States Capitol attack pay legal costs and sells merchandise. Our FBI director has... Oh my God. I cannot. Okay. Sometimes research is a double-edged sword. Do I feel safer knowing this? No, I do not. But onward we go, because the show must go on. Facts over feelings. With that out of the way, let's talk about some facts. Did you know that we had over 300 mass shootings in this country so far just this year in 2025? 300. In fact, since 2020, not 1 year has gone by where the mass shootings did not surpass 488, with the highest numbers being in 2000, 2021, 2022, and 2023. During the height of COVID, we were experiencing some of the worst mass shootings in the United States. Do you know how many children died this year in mass shootings? Over 800. That's a mixture of very young children and teenagers. Just think of that. Right before Charlie Kirk was shot, he was asked how many trans shooters there are, and Charlie's response was too many. That answer was 5, by the way. 5 trans shooters. That's not even 1%. It's meaningless, right? I mean, if we're going to use that. But by the way, we're going to reveal the percentage of white supremacist mass shooters later, and it will probably surprise you. And I can assure you it's much higher than 1%. And when Kirk was asked about how many total mass shootings there were in the United States, he responded with, "Does gang violence count?" Given the demonization of migrant workers and immigrants in this country, it is clear what Kirk was trying to imply here. Dog whistles like that are all too common in the rhetoric that comes out of the mouths of pundits like Tucker Carlson, Matt Walsh, and so many others. And according to the Rockefeller Institute of Government, Hispanic people make up 9.2% of all mass shootings in the United States, which is more than 1%, but far less than even 15%. So when he's asked this question, these debate bros, they pivot. They pivot when someone asks them anything challenging, because they and the people that use this debate style knows that the answer is something that doesn't support their position. While the stats may differ from study to study, the conclusions are the same. The facts don't back up his position or his prejudices. Because when you get right down to it, the facts tell us that gun violence that we see in the United States is not normal. The rest of the world does not see over 800 children die in a year to gun violence. They don't see that because we are the outlier. We are the anomaly. The dishonesty behind debate bro tactics and the facts they don't want you to know. The debate tactic that people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson constantly use, let's talk about that for a bit. People like Jordan Peterson, Matt Walsh, and the late Charlie Kirk will host these debates where they intentionally target students at universities. And let's be real, people in their late teens and early 20s are basically just teenagers who happen to have driver's licenses and can drink and sign for student loans. Your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until around the age of 25, and sometimes it's even way later than that. Did you know that in mammals, the prefrontal cortex controls your memory, how parts of your body move, your ability to reason, decision-making, how you express your personality, determining what is and isn't appropriate to say in social situations, your memory and processing, literacy, and risk assessment? So these older men will go into schools and debate these kids, many of them being first-year college students, so you know, children who recently graduated high school, and those who haven't received any media training. They're not master debaters. And people like Walsh and Peterson will do their level best to pivot away from answering any questions that would undermine their pre-planned and rehearsed talking points. They use this little trick on college students who, let me remind you again, have no media training. so that they can roast them on YouTube and other types of social media and deliberately use it to undermine arguments for gun control, trans rights, and the role of racism in the US with clickbaity titles like "Charlie Kirk destroys college student, clueless liberal student gets a lesson," or "Candace Owen melts snowflake." Now, I mention this not to suggest that Kirk deserves what happened to him. Do not make that assumption or claim. My point is this: no one deserves to be the victim of gun violence. Kirk, Shapiro, and Walsh all argue in bad faith supporting the National Rifle Association, better known as the NRA, an organization that actively undermines our ability to study gun violence in America. Kirk once said that the deaths that we see every year are worth the price of protecting the Second Amendment. No matter how you analyze that, that is a horrible thing to put out into the world. The truth is that people like Jordan Peterson, Candace Owens, and Matt Walsh cosplay as intellectuals, or at the very least, what they think the general public thinks of as intellectuals, and they tend to use very big words to make themselves sound smarter to their audiences. But it's nothing more than a costume or a caricature of what an intellectual is supposed to look like. They want to reach young men with their rhetoric. They want to sell them on the narrative that colleges and schools are nothing more than left-leaning indoctrination camps. They want to radicalize them. Ask yourself, why do these grown-ass men go after college students instead of university professors who have media training, who have experience debating ideas? Why go after children? Well, part of that is because most academics and scholars don't want to participate in debates with people like Peterson or Walsh. They don't want to waste energy on someone that they see as being disingenuous. But, I mean, seriously, it does need to be said. Our academic leaders need to step forward and start participating in this conversation. Make it a call to action. If you are a professor out there, it is time to stand up and speak out. But let's dial it back to the facts. Let's talk about the things that the political pundits on the right don't want you to know. 80%. Don Cheadle may blame the radical left for all the political violence that we're seeing today, but the facts tell a very different tale. The fact is, most mass shooters are white men. I don't bring that up to say that white men are predisposed to being bad. That would be eugenics. And folks, eugenics is bad. That is not the point that the leftists or myself are trying to make when I bring this figure up either. Because I'm going to tell you what I feel is the real culprit of this mess. Statistically, 54% of all mass shooters are white and 94.5% are male. But why? Why is that? Why is it that workplaces and schools are the most likely place where gun violence is to occur? And why is it that right-leaning propagandists like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson constantly and deliberately pivot away from this reality? It would certainly be nice if we could study this phenomenon and actually do something about it, right? But the NRA actively stifles research into this area. The 1996 Dickey Amendment basically stopped the CDC and other federal organizations from being able to do any studies on gun violence in this country. The NRA said, you can either do research or you can keep your guns, but if you let the research go forward, you will lose all your guns. Wild. Pundits like Shapiro, Kirk, and Peterson fed this narrative that the left is coming for your Second Amendment right. Oh, we're f***ing not. Look, no sane person on the left wants gun violence like this. I think what you are missing from the reactions that people are having to this tragedy is that we are f***ing tired. We are tired of seeing children die. We are tired of hundreds and hundreds of children dying every single year for a problem that has been all but solved in other democratic countries. We are tired of paying the cost while incurious minds refuse to look at the cause. And we have asked, all we have asked for year after year since Columbine is common sense gun regulation. No ordinary person needs access to assault weaponry at the bare minimum. If any of these mass shooters couldn't get access to these weapons, then the hundreds of children we see gunned down every single year would be minimized. And let's be clear, there shouldn't be any. There should be no child lost to gun violence ever. No child should have to see what Charlie's kids, wife, or the survivors of those 300 mass shootings have seen so far just in 2025. And yet, Gun rights activists will sit there and cry, "People kill people, it's not the guns." But that is ridiculous. I'm pretty sure you're far less likely to die if someone comes at you with, say, literally any other weapon than an AR-15. I have to ask, though, did you know that Charlie Kirk actively cheered on the death of Democratic Senator Melissa Horton and her husband in Minnesota? Why aren't we talking about Melissa every single day? Or when he asked his listeners to bail out the guy who broke into Nancy Pelosi's home and beat her husband with a hammer? I don't bring up those facts as some kind of whataboutism, but to ask you to think for a second. Ask yourself why you're not seeing those stories, other than just saying those stories are being suppressed by the algorithm. Or maybe ask why conservatives are more willing to speak out when it happens to someone like Kirk, but not Melissa, or the 800 plus children who have died so far this year. The media wants you to focus on Kirk, and yes, that is a tragedy. It never should have happened, but it could have been prevented. This is a much bigger problem in the US. And while there are mass shooters across the political spectrum, the number of left-leaning shooters is very small compared to those on the right. And though it's certainly interesting to note that 80% of mass shooters are white supremacists. Here's the thing. The common narrative is that most of the people who have perpetrated these mass shootings have had mental illnesses, and that we need more mental health services to combat this trend. But that is actually a myth, even one that our writers have found themselves repeating in the past without realizing it. Actually, a very small percentage of these mass shooters are perpetrated by people with mental illness. So the facts of the matter are that we've got a phenomenon where 80% of these shootings are perpetrated by white supremacists. And I mean, no one likes the KKK or the hate that comes out of their mouths, right? Right? We can agree on that. Right? We have a phenomenon where 54% of the perpetrators are white and 95.3% are male. And again, why is that? That's like so weird, right? And by the way, I'm just asking questions here, so you can't be mad at me for having you just think about what's going on for a second.
We're all in this together, right?
For decades now, lawmakers on the right have shot down any common sense gun legislation, and suddenly, when someone on their side of the island is a victim of this very preventable phenomenon, it's the Democrats' fault? This is a disgusting play from MAGA to provoke political violence against the left. It's a poorly framed gotcha, totally in line with the radical right's debate bro tactics. And look, I come from a fundamentalist Christian background. Eric, the head writer who did a lot of the research and writing for this specific piece, grew up with young earth creationism and the evangelical religious right putting awful things into his head about all this kind of stuff. Eric remembers his church in middle school proclaiming that George W. Bush was sent by God to usher in the end of days. He remembers parroting the racist things said by Rush Limbaugh and John and Ken from KFI, the awful things they would say about poor people, Mexicans, and their opponents, the terrible things that his parents and guardians said. He remembers watching the towers falling 24 years ago when he should have been reading about Rikki Tikki Tavi, the solar system, and evolution. We all remember hearing about Columbine. We remember hearing about the countless shootings over the years. We remember them blending into a coagulated mess. Eric remembers becoming numb to it. Eric was once a conservative. At least he was brought up to be. He was brought up to believe in an Earth that was 6,000 years old, and brought up to believe that evolution was a lie and that scientists were perpetrating a great evil. He was taught to actively push back and debate his teachers in high school, taught to check out and ignore what was right in front of his eyes. But perhaps most importantly, he was brought up to believe, just like Charlie did, that gun violence was an acceptable cost, so long as the Second Amendment is protected at all costs. Those teachings did real damage to his life, his academic career. But he grew up, eventually. He pulled his head out of his ass. He learned how to read scientific papers, learned how to do proper research, and identify bias in media. He gained media literacy and taught himself. He stopped parroting what right-wing leaning pundits, parents, and family filled his head with all those years ago. Today, he knows that evolution is a fact, that scientific theories are not just unproven guesses by the godless pushing an agenda. Those theories are as close as a bunch of bipedal ape descendants who evolved telling stories about campfires in the sky can come to objective truth. That doesn't mean there isn't a god or gods or goddesses. That doesn't mean that the paranormal things we've experienced aren't real or can't fit into the theory of everything whenever we find it. He no longer believes that gay people are sinners. He doesn't believe in sin at all. And he no longer believes that gun violence is an acceptable price to pay. He no longer sees the statistics as just numbers. He's not numb anymore. He's not without hope for humanity. And you can take that journey too. What we saw from the online left after Kirk's death is not necessarily the celebration of a man dying, although I am sure there are plenty of people who were sincere about those feelings. Most of it, I feel, is the collective frustration of people who have been dialed into a cycle of violence and are sick of it. People who care deeply about this issue, who are tired of seeing children and innocent people die while gun lobbyists and companies line their pockets. It isn't about left or right. It's about extremism. Kirk would still be here if we had common sense gun laws that prevented people from getting a hold of weapons that can kill a lot of people very quickly. By the way, another mass shooting broke out in Colorado the same day that Charlie Kirk was shot. Okay, so the United States is an anomaly when it comes to gun violence, but how do we fix it? Let's discuss a country that, like us, was the product of colonialism, faced down a similar disturbing trend of increased gun violence and mass shootings, and found a better way. Stopping the gun violence epidemic. Let's go back in time to 1996, the same year that the NRA lobbied for the Dickey Amendment that stopped federal investigations into gun violence from being funded. Australia had just seen a horrific mass shooting at the historic Port Arthur site in Tasmania. 35 people are dead. Many more are wounded. The killer is a white young male. He uses 3 powerful guns to murder some folks at a guest house before making his way over to Port Arthur, where he unleashes hell. The police give chase. The culprit murders a hostage before the cops finally get him. He pleads guilty. The survivors mourn. The country is shocked to its core. But instead of offering platitudes and thoughts and prayers, people like Rebecca Peters, probably the world's foremost expert on gun control today, get to work on a campaign to fix the problem. Rebecca Peters debates the vice president of the Firearms Owner Association, Ian McNiven. Ian makes the claim that all the proposed guns that would need to be banned would be needed to fend off an invasion of Indonesians. Rebecca Peters replies by saying that domestic violence is probably a much bigger issue. And then, in a hot mic moment, Ian says, "I tell you what, if I was married to Rebecca Peters, I'd probably commit domestic violence too." Best get this man a PBR and a wife beater, am I right? Not long after that debacle of a debate, and within weeks of the Port Arthur mass shooting, Australian Prime Minister John Howard announces massive changes to gun laws in Australia. The reforms have the support of all 6 states, every territory. In short, the country came together. Once the laws go into effect, Australia begins buying back semi-automatic pump-action shotguns and high-powered rifles at market value too. In total, the Australian federal government buys back 700,000 banned guns from the population and destroys them. So, what do we see in the years after Australia's comprehensive gun reform? Well, I'll tell you what we don't see. Mass shootings. The statistics don't lie. Studies and data analysis have shown that in addition to there being no mass shootings in Australia since 1996, gun-related deaths, crimes, and suicides are down by at least 4% per year since gun control was introduced. Hell, even other forms of violent crime are down. Why? Because it's very difficult for the average jackoff to just purchase a gun. They have intense background checks and police requiring a good reason for someone to need a firearm. And guess what? Self-defense, automatic denial. Before those laws were adopted, Australia saw mass shootings every single year, going back to 1981. From 1981 to 1996, the total number of victims who died in a mass shooting in Australia was 104. 35 people. Victims. That's all it took in Australia, a nation that's often looked at by the United States as being a dangerously wild place. It's full of giant spiders so big they have health bars. To wake up and collectively say, something is wrong here and we need to fix it. By comparison, the US has seen a holocaust of gun-related deaths, many of them children. The death toll by comparison is staggering. In 2023, 46,728 people died from firearms in the United States. Of those, 46,728 people, 1,622 deaths were children. This year alone, we've had 168 children up to the age of 11 and 715 teenagers aged 12 to 17 die due to gun violence. So why is it that Australia is able to pull their collective heads out of their ass and solve the problem and we can't? Is it the Second Amendment? I don't believe so. There is a valid argument that reasonable common sense gun laws could ban assault weapons that allow these shooters to kill a lot of people in a very short amount of time without the need to get rid of the Second Amendment. Everyday people do not need to own an AR-15 or a machine gun or a high-powered rifle like the one that was allegedly used to kill Charlie Kirk. Fact of the matter is, when Charlie Kirk said that some deaths were acceptable, he was wrong. No death is acceptable when it comes to domestic violence. Just think about it. Tens of thousands of gun owners voluntarily turned over their weapons. A country came together to address a preventable tragedy, and it worked. Australia is the blueprint for a future in the US where there are no mass shootings, a US where children don't have to be scared of going to school, where they don't have to do active shooter drills, where gun violence is not the norm of American life, where people across the political spectrum don't have to worry about literally being shot for their political beliefs. And that, to me, looks like courage. Thank you all so much. My name is Lacie Madison. This has been a Doculite Media production. You are listening to Courage, Stories of Everyday Hope.